Hey guys, today I'm going to walk you through the build of this teardrop style door. When I was looking at what I could have for a mini camper, I liked the teardrops or the square drops. They have a lot of good pluses to them, but the one major negative is that you can't stand up. Like putting on your pants in one is a struggle. It's almost like being in a tent. So because of that, I went with a cargo trailer. It was the quickest build also. Like the time to actually get this up and running was going to be much shorter, at least in my mind. It is still taking longer than I envisioned. It's amazing how long each of these steps can take. But anyway, today I'm going to tell you about the teardrop door. So the idea was, rather than have a full-size RV door, and then you have kind of steps that you're getting up into it, all that kind of stuff to consider, having something where you could come over, sit down, swing yourself inside. You know, it's large enough you can pass gear through. It's a nice, easy, stealth way to get in and out of the camper if you're going to be in a rest area or something like that. And it also, the real added benefit is that someone can't lock me into this with the cargo trailer style doors. So, you know, there are obviously ways that you can counter that, but this was really kind of ticking all of the boxes for me. So you can order a teardrop door. This one is 36 high and I think it's about 24 wide. You can order one in that size, and in fact I went off of that as an idea for what size I wanted. And they cost somewhere in a range of $300. If I think about what I put into this, when adding up like this aluminum S channel that was a special order kind of thing, you know, not something you're just going to get at the big box store. And then if you were buying the lock, I already happen to have the lock, so that was a plus for me. The rubber seals, the plywood, all of the pieces that go into it, you might come close to $300. I don't know. I'll put a link down below to the one that I was looking at. It would certainly speed up the build time. But at any rate, in order to get that one installed or to get this one installed, the first thing you have to do is cut a big hole in the side of your cargo trailer. So we're going to start there. Here's how I did it. The studs in my cargo trailer are set up about 24 inches on center. This is going to vary based on the model that you get. So obviously you'll need to know how many of these you're going to have to cut out. What I did here was I placed, after I unscrewed the screws that are on the outside that are holding that aluminum shell to these steel studs, I was able to slip a 1/4 inch piece of plywood between the stud and that shell. I was really concerned that I was going to end up cutting through the steel and then also through the aluminum that's much softer. So the 1/4 inch plywood worked out well. Later on, I did also use a 1/2 inch piece of plywood just to create a little more space. The other thing that I would suggest is that you use a new cutting wheel. My cutting wheel was pretty worn down, and so getting into this corner was a little difficult. I had to kind of maneuver around to actually get the stud fully cut. This angle shows a better shot of that interior bit that with the worn down cutting wheel I had a difficult time getting to. But once that was cut, we were all set. I welded the frame together with 1 inch steel tubing that was 1/8 inch thickness. This fit perfectly between the studs and the aluminum shell, and so it was nice and easy to weld in place later on. This frame would become the supports not only for the door itself, but also for the larger structure of the cargo trailer. Since I cut that one stud in half, there was a large span, almost 48 inches, that wasn't well supported. So this would serve both of those purposes. I'm a novice welder, so please keep that in mind when you watch this footage. In general, I tend to overbuild, so even if any of these welds wasn't perfect, and they certainly don't look perfect, but even if they didn't hold up perfectly, there are a number of other welds that would be holding that structure in place. After that, cleaned it up with a grinder, mostly so that I could fit the framing in. And then it was time to cut the big hole in the side of the trailer. I have to say, this was a really nerve-wracking process. I put the frame that I created in place and with a Sharpie traced a line where it needed to get cut. And then I took the air nibbler to make the cut. What you see here is me making a pilot hole so that I could get the air nibbler in place. And I'm just using one of those Christmas tree bits that starts out small and gradually gets larger and larger. So once I had that hole in place, I was free to start cutting. This tool is air powered, so it really is, it's heavy on the compressor. You'll hear the compressor kick in and out a number of times. And basically it just nibbles out a little half moon shape with each move of the piston up and down. It's a little hard to control and keep straight, but it allows me to get in tighter than a jigsaw does on that interior line. The blue tape that you see there is just to cover up the screw holes. This build project, or this door project, took place over a number of days, and so I didn't want rain getting in on the days where the holes were just open. Once I had this hole cut, I also used more blue tape and some garbage bags in order to keep it covered through the various steps until this project was complete. I think it would have been difficult to do all of these steps in one day, considering that the piece that I'm cutting out right now I glued in place on the door in order to have it match the rest of the trailer. So obviously the wait time for the glue to dry and all required that this be open for a couple of days. And that was it. I have to say, although I was nervous about it, it went pretty smoothly. And there you see me climb through it for the very first time. So once I got the hole cut, the next step was to get our new structure in place. I was happy that this fit pretty tightly. Moving the wiring out of the way there. That's the trailer wiring for the side marker lights. So you'll notice on the right hand side of the frame how it slips underneath the existing S-shaped stud, which made it really easy to tack in place. I'm just going around tacking all of the connections between the studs and my new structure. After this was in place, I added in the S-shaped aluminum to the outside, which would be the foundation for the weather seal, allowing me to prevent any moisture hopefully, from entering around the door. Unfortunately, I seem to have lost the footage for that, but here's a couple of snapshots. You can see here I'm holding it in place with some clamps, and it frames out the entire opening. The core of the door is built out of 1/2-inch Baltic birch plywood. It's a expensive plywood that doesn't have a lot of voids within it, and it's got a lot of layers. It's also somewhat weather resistant. It's built with glue that will allow for exterior uses. So we cut it to the size of the door, which is roughly 36 inches high and about 2 feet wide. Today we're starting work on the door. This is going to be a teardrop style door on the side of the cargo trailer. It's going to have an RV style latch. I took this off of my RV when I installed the keyless entry lock. So I just happen to have this laying around. So this is going to sandwich in here and has to sit something like this. I think the first thing I want to do is kind of sketch out roughly where this hole is going to have to be for the entire housing. So let's first find our center point. Still roughly 36 tall, so what is that, 18? But in the meantime, okay, if we're doing center, I'm going to put the lock piece at the center. So the actual body of this might not be perfectly centered, but the lock will. I think that's going to make me happy. Made a big old mess on the other side. Should have put another block beneath it. I knew better than that. I'll speed this up to spare you some of the time it took to get this down. This was by far the most intricate piece of the build. I'm sure in an RV factory they have a template they slap up against it and probably route out the interior. But this took a lot of trial and error for me to get it right, as you'll see here. I'll put links down below to both a regular style RV door lock and the keyless entry version that I put on my RV. if you're going to buy one anyway, it might be worthwhile to get. It's so nice to be able to walk up to it and just press the code and walk in. In addition to using the jigsaw to cut out the shapes, I also had to route out some of the wood here that would allow for the latch to make its way through to the door frame. At this point, there were still two places it wouldn't clear. On the sides, there were some little nubs that stuck out that didn't have a clear purpose, but it's probably for the internal mechanism. And then also the area underneath the bolt. And so we did more cutting. Okay, I should still be able to get that whole range there. It's a much cleaner job than the last one. Ho ho! That be it. Yeah, so we're going to need a little more thickness on the door, but that's okay. That'll work. So I think next step, I'm going to start to build up the door around this. And I can actually have the pieces that come up, butt right into that, put something else on top. Beautiful. My targeted thickness for the door was 1 inch. That allows it to fit within the 1 1/8 inch S channel that is the kind of weather seal that's around the door frame. So in order to keep weight down, I only wanted the 1 inch thickness on the outside of the door. And I think I might throw a 1/2 inch insulation into that cavity that's in the center. And then maybe run some cedar planking over it. We'll have to see. I haven't decided on that yet. So the rest of this followed pretty much the same sequence of cutting out a space for the handle. Once that was done, I threw a coat of that gray porch paint onto the whole door just in order to seal it up a little more. And then I got ready to put the aluminum shell from the trailer that I cut off on top of the door. So because the door is obviously smaller than the opening, there will be some on the sides that I'm going to have to trim off. I attached the aluminum to the plywood with a Liquid Nails product called Fuse It. It's supposed to bond all kinds of different things. Being that aluminum can sometimes be difficult to bond to surfaces, I figured I'd spend a little more for this fancy Liquid Nails. The other nice thing is that it says that it cures at all kinds of temperatures, even below freezing, and always remains a little bit flexible. Knowing that I was going to be routing around that hole, I spread out the adhesive because I wanted to make sure that I got a really good grip and didn't tear up the aluminum when I was cutting that hole out. If I was doing this again, I would smooth down all of those ridges further before I applied the aluminum. I had to really roll it pretty hard with the roller, and I think even then I didn't get it absolutely perfectly spread out. So it probably would have been worthwhile to hit all of that adhesive with a brush beforehand and save myself some time here. I then let the door cure for a day before I started to trim the outside. The first method I used to trim the aluminum was this pair of heavy-duty scissors. It did an okay job, but it tended to kind of bend the aluminum a little bit and flare it out. Next thing I tried was the router with a flush trim bit. So essentially it's got a little bearing on the bottom that runs along the plywood and then trims the aluminum up to the edge of the plywood. This worked a lot better, though it also did leave a little burr on the outside. Luckily, there's going to be some aluminum trim that goes over that, so you're never going to see it. Then I cut a hole for the lock assembly, same way that I did the other. Just drilled with a step drill here till it was large enough to get the router bit inside. And as you probably saw with me drilling the same hole in the outside to create the hole for the door, I once again didn't go large enough on my first drill. So I had to go back and make it a little larger. I'm not sure why I didn't go bigger here. There's no harm, all that material is getting removed anyway. The router made quick work of removing the rest of the material here, and I didn't even need to worry about the edges. When you use a round over bit like this, each of the corners is going to have a little bit of a round to it, but the lock went in fine without making any adjustments. Once that was all set, I was ready to apply the aluminum angle to the outside. These pieces seal the aluminum to the plywood door and then provide a basis for mounting the hinges as well as the additional welder seal that goes on the outside. I use that same adhesive to attach these, hoping it would also seal up the corners a little, prevent any water intrusion into the plywood. You'll notice I also had to trim that aluminum angle for the door handle, and then I also created an opening where the bolt goes and use that aluminum instead of the plate that comes with the door handle. I used some screws with a large head that were 3/4 of an inch long to secure the aluminum angle onto the door. I attached the hinges. Now, if you're paying close attention on this video, you'll notice that there's another set of holes that's already here. I had this hinge in place in the center as one long hinge, and it didn't work perfectly, we'll say. So I took it down. I cut the hinge, the piano hinge, in half, and then I put it at both ends. That allows for a much sturdier door. Because I had them, I also used some longer screws than came with it. I wanted the screws to get fairly deep into the plywood core of the door so that they would really hold. Each of the aluminum edges did require a little bit of filing. When you cut them with the bandsaw, like I did, it leaves a rough edge. And so there was a little bit of fine tuning. Now I'm attaching the outside weather seal that will mate up with the trailer, and it will have the rubber weather seal underneath it. This was a little tricky because I wanted to have about 3/16 inch overhang so that the door itself was on the same plane as the outside of the cargo trailer. But then this weather seal aluminum would stick out a little bit in order to provide its job. So you see I'm using a little spacer here, a feeler gauge of sorts, to align the aluminum properly. I used clamps to hold it in place, and then I moved on to the multiple operations of attaching this. I'm only going to show you a couple of the holes here because it was a very repetitive task. This is one place where having a number of drills really paid off. The first step was using a punch to make sure that when I started drilling, it didn't want to wander around on the metal. Because of where the clamp was, I couldn't do the next hole right where I wanted, so I went a little past it. So the first drill that I use here is a small size drill bit that is going to allow the screw to gain purchase in the plywood. However, for the metal that it also has to go through, this is a little small for the screw and would provide a little too much friction. So after I did the small hole, I went through the aluminum with a slightly larger drill bit just so that the drill could clear. After that, I countersunk it with another drill and then finally put the fastener in and rinsed and repeat the whole way around the door. Putting it all together. So like I said, I had already put this door on once. The last time the hinge was in the center, so you can see the holes that are there. But anyway, as far as the process goes, I had my wife hold the door the last time as I drilled the holes and put the initial screws in. She wasn't around for this time, and I think it actually worked better to use these clamps to hold it in place. Nothing against my wife, but I felt like I was kind of under the gun when she was standing there holding it. And it's not an easy thing to hold without having it move at all. So the clamps were much easier as far as holding it exactly where I wanted it, having time to check the measurements. And when I say the clamps were easier, they weren't necessarily easier to get in place, as you see with my struggles there. Anyway, once they were in place, it really worked well. So I checked and made sure that everything aligned. Sorry for the bad camera angle. It's a great view of the back of my head. But I used a little piece of plywood that was 1/4 inch to make sure that the alignment was the same on the top and on the bottom. This is really important when you're putting in a hinge like this or a door like this, so that it doesn't want to swing open or closed based on where you misalign the hinges. I then drilled some pilot holes for the screws and put in the screws. Now these screws are going all into metal. So one of the things that I definitely relearned on this project was you have to make sure that that drill bit is really sized for the screws that you're using. Otherwise you're going to snap some screw heads off. If the screw starts really binding, then back it off, drill a little bit larger hole, and proceed. That's it. Once all the screws are in place, I was able to remove the clamps and test out the door. It was really nice to get to these final last steps of weather sealing the door from the elements. So up first I put on a drip edge, and I put some silicone tube behind that. It works not only as adhesive, but also should prevent some of the water intrusion from the holes that I made. This drip edge essentially will catch any rain or water that's flowing down the side of the cargo trailer and prevent it from going directly into the door. So that's why it overhangs, both sticking out further and along the sides. You'll notice that the factory did something similar on the rear door. So I just kind of copied the same thing. I also rounded out the edges of this so that hopefully when I inevitably bang my head on it, I don't cut my head open. But we'll see. I was using this Milwaukee rivet tool, which is really handy, but there's no need for it. You could definitely do this with a hand riveter just as easily. I just happen to already own this, so I'll use it anytime I can. Second to last step in my weather sealing was to run silicone 2 over all the edges. So I did this outside on all the aluminum as well as inside and on the door itself. Anywhere I thought it could be useful, I added it. As long as you have a tube open, why not, right? After that was the final weather seal, and that is a bead of rubber gasket material. I first cleaned up the aluminum with isopropyl alcohol so that it would stick well. Cut strips of the gasket material to fit and attach them on the top, the side, the bottom, and also on the interior that has the hinges. This mostly is just to prevent any road spray from working its way in between the two pieces of aluminum and finding its way into the camper itself. Anything that does make it in, though, and is against that interior aluminum should hopefully drip down to the bottom. And because the bottom's all sealed up on the interior, it'll end up dripping outside the cargo trailer. Well, that's it. I know this was a long build. If you stayed to the end, I appreciate it. Certainly, if you have any questions about this build, drop them in the comments below. If you have any suggestions that I might be able to still implement, I'd love to hear them. Otherwise, that's all for today. Don't forget to subscribe to see the rest of the build videos. I have another one coming out, I think, on how I attach that spare tire is next. And then we'll get into the interior, and I've got videos on the walls and on the countertop, kitchen sink, max air fan, all that stuff coming up soon.